This is WZRD Chicago 88.3 FM. We have with us at WZRD today Ed Yohnka of the ACLU to discuss with us some of the things that the ACLU is working on behalf of immigrant children. Welcome to WZRD, Ed.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. Could you describe for us the ACLU's work on behalf of the immigrant children?
Yes, so the ACLU nationally and through our Immigrant Rights Project has obtained an order from the court to reunite all of the children who were separated by the Trump administration's policies that we've all heard so much about, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 children. We worked through the court almost every day running up to the July 26th deadline in order to hold the government accountable and assure that every child was reunited with their parent, and to try to ensure to the greatest extent we can that the government is actually being forthright and honest when it says that children have been reunited, when it notes, what's happening with children. And, I know we're going to talk a little bit about where we are now, but one of the other things we've attempted to do in this is to ensure that both children as well as their parents have an ability to fully address their rights under immigration law. One of the concerns that we have is that so many of the parents of children were coerced into signing paperwork which would lead to their deportation without really fairly adjudicating whether or not they have a right to stay here in the United States, whether it's an asylum claim or whether it's some other sort of claim. And so one of the things that has been a major focus, which I think is true for both children and families, is to try to assure that they have the capacity to have those things heard before they are simply deported and sent back to a country where their lives may be at risk.
Have the children being separated from their parents for these immigrant families been happening before, or did it just start now with the Trump administration?
I think it's fair to say that there were let's start at the top. I think when you think about family separation, we're thinking about what's happened at the southern border over the last few months, which was really a human rights crisis that the Trump administration created. That said, our immigration policies and enforcing our immigration policies and the kind of workplace raids that we've seen over the last couple of decades have separated thousands of families. So we shouldn't act like family separation simply started as the result of these particular actions. Yes. But I don't know that we've ever seen actions taken in the way that we have over the past few months, which were taken with the specific intent of separating families. And I think that's the difference.
To discourage other families from trying to attempt immigrating to the U.S., right?
Well, that was the claim, is that, even though they were the administration was warned of two things. They were warned, first of all, that taking this action and attempting to coerce families or scare families from Central and South America not to come to the United States wouldn't work. And in fact, the data shows that it hasn't worked. People are leaving for their own individual reasons. There's not some grand, glorious sort of thing that they think that they're leaving or not leaving because the administration is doing policy A or policy B. That's just folly. And I think the administration over-exaggerated its authority and its power, not just in detaining the children in the way that they did, but also in terms of the impact that it could have. And the second thing I think we've seen is that, they were warned that if you separated these families, if you divided them, it would cause long-term permanent damage to the children who were separated. And of course, they simply decided they didn't care. Right. And I think that is, in many ways, that is, really shows a level of cruelty and incompetence, the likes of which we've never seen. So let me just go back to your question about whether or not we've seen this before. whatever we've seen before, we've never seen anything like what we've seen over the past few months. We have never seen the government of the United States say, number one, that they wanted to separate children from their parents in order to send this signal that they were tough on immigration that was going to keep people out. We have never seen the detention of so many children, including children of a very young age, in really horrific conditions. You know, we kept kids in cages. That's what our government did with our tax dollars. They kept kids in cages, and we've never seen anything like that. And the third thing is that we've never seen a process in which, having separated so many children, the government literally had no plan for reuniting them with their parents. And I don't think that can be underscored enough, that when they started this program, when they decided to do this, they literally had no idea of how they were ever going to reunite those children with their parents. And I think it raises the question as to whether or not they ever intended to in the first instance.
How did the ACLU become involved in helping these separated immigrant families?
Well, that's really kind of an interesting story, and a story that has some connections to Chicago. We became aware of the case of an individual back in back in the early part of this year. I can't remember if it was January or February. And it had to do with a woman who's known in the litigation as Ms. L. Ms. L was a woman from the Democratic Republic of Congo who escaped persecution and threats of death with her 10-year-old daughter in Congo, made her way to the United States, actually arrived at the port of San Diego with nothing on her back, with literally nothing except for her 10-year-old daughter, presented herself to a Customs and Border Patrol agent, passed a credible fear exam, and was then transferred to the custody of ICE because she was going to be processed through the asylum, was claiming asylum, and was going to go through that process. A few days into that, she was taken into detention, and her daughter was separated from her screaming, put on a plane, and taken to Chicago. The ACLU was made aware by lawyers in San Diego about this. We interviewed Ms. L, discovered where her daughter was. And by the way, I should say, because I think this is something that I don't want to be too parochial about this, but, we have to remember that not everybody knows what Chicago is. When Ms. L was told that her daughter was going to Chicago, she didn't know if that was a place, if that was a person, if that was a planet. It just wasn't something that she had a connection to, let alone the fact that it was thousands of miles away and she was not going to be able to, really speak to her daughter regularly for the next few months. When we filed the lawsuit on behalf of Ms. L, two things happened. First, the Department of Homeland Security claimed that it was all a mistake. It was an accident. They shouldn't have separated them, and that all that Ms. L needed to do was to prove that this was her daughter, although it then took them weeks to submit to a DNA test and discover quickly that it was, in fact, her daughter. But the second thing is that we began to discover that there were hundreds of other families and children who were in a similar circumstance, and that was really the beginning, kind of the front end of this process of separating families and children. And we filed a class action lawsuit that actually became the vehicle for the court order forcing the government to reunify those families. So it is, as often happens, you learn about one instance in something like this, and it really reveals a much larger problem and a much larger issue.
You're saying that the ACLU was instrumental in finding out about the situation. You had the scoop over the news then, it seemed, right?
I think we saw it before people really recognized that it was an issue in terms of that, and I think we were able to see the extent and the scope and the scale of the problem before anyone else could. I'd like to, it's funny. I tell this story sometimes to friends who forget about the way this happened. Back in March, we had a protest on Federal Plaza in downtown Chicago to demand that Ms. L be reunited with her daughter. It turned out that as we were having the protest, Ms. L was flying on her way to Chicago to be reunified with her daughter. And it turned out that, we were discovering and learning that there were all these other children. We had, I would estimate, about 50 people who were there for that. Now, fast forward to June, the end of June, when there is a protest on Daley Plaza to protest the separation of families, and there were 50,000 people there at that time. We knew the issue, we knew what the problem was, but one of the things it often takes, and I think especially in the current environment, is that it takes a considerable period of time to kind of raise the profile on an issue like this and really make people understand the scope of it.
The ACLU across the U.S. is helping in this effort, or is it concentrated in specific cities mostly?
So it's a little bit of both. One of the things that's clearly happening is most of the legal work is being done in the Southern District of California in San Diego, where the court is that has issued the orders around this. ACLU affiliates in a number of places across the country have been assisting when it comes to, identifying places where children were held, or, looking at issues specific to individual children, providing a hand in terms of the way in which sometimes the way in which children are detained. But it has been centered and certainly along all along the southern border from San Diego to Texas, certainly working with helping to get both doctors, other kind of care providers, psychiatrists and others, as well as public officials into detention centers to help ensure the public and that policymakers really understood what was happening in those instances and in those locations. So there's been a range of work, I'd say, across the country that has been, that's been done, and certainly ACLU affiliates in every state have spoken to public, elected officials at the federal level, have spoken to governors and others, and, talked to them about concerns about this issue, and I think really helped to build what I think is a formidable wall of opposition to this policy, which seems only to be supported by the president, people in the White House, and his closest acolytes.
So has the ACLU been involved in Heartland Center, for instance, in housing these immigrant children to keep track of their state?
We have not as yet. We know that others, including Heartland itself has commissioned an investigation. DCFS is looking at that. We have not taken any action in that area or done that as yet. I think if we thought that was an appropriate and important thing to do, if there was a specific instance that caused us to think that was something worth pursuing, we would. I think what we've been, all of us have been focused on to the degree we can, is to be sure that every one of these children is reunited with their parent as quickly as possible.
Do you know approximately how many have not yet been reunited with their families?
So there still remain more than 500 children who have not been reunited. That, in large measure, has been a hard number to get the government to acknowledge, but it seems as of last week, we now know that number is a little bit more than 500. We know that, for example, many of them were not reunited because the parents were deported. The parents actually took voluntary deportation under the belief that if they were deported, they would have their children with them. And in fact, what the government did was simply to deport the parents and not reunite them with their children. And one of the most, I think, troubling aspects from the most recent developments around this case is that the government has actually vigorously opposed any sense, which the ACLU has argued for, that the children that the parents who were deported and their children remain in the United States, that those parents should be able to re-enter the United States, be reunified with their children, and actually have an opportunity, again, to argue their case in whatever immigration court or setting is appropriate, either for asylum or for some other relief, because these are parents really who made a decision in a coercive way and not really with their best legal interests in mind.
What was the peak? What was the total number before the 500? So how many were reunited.
Yeah. Well, we believe that at maximum, the numbers that were separated by the Trump administration policy, reached nearly 3,000. It was probably, more than 2,900, maybe a little bit less than 3,000. So on the one hand, we're talking about 2,500 children who have been reunited. On the other hand, I think the more important number is to keep our eye on is the 500 children who are at real risk of becoming orphans as the result of this policy, who are at real risk of never, ever seeing their parents again.
What are the options? What's next for these children if they really become so-called orphans?
Well, I hate to think about what their options are if they become orphans. I suppose that among other things that we would have to consider, for example, what happens with regards to, children going into the child welfare system and looking at, foster care and ultimately adoption, if that were the case. But I think that one of the more glaring things was that, we have argued for a couple of weeks to the government that what they should be doing is sharing the information about the parents, their last known address, a phone number, any of those kinds of things, to share that information with us and with other non-governmental organizations that are accustomed both to working in the countries of origin, but also, organizations like the Red Cross that are accustomed to reuniting children. And that if the government would just share this information, that we could move to a place where we could facilitate reunification. What was really outrageous was, at one point when we made this suggestion through a court filing, the government literally said, okay, the ACLU should do that. They should reunify the children. Just walking away from any responsibility that they have. And I thought that, the judge in the case made clear that the government was accountable and responsible for reunifying all these children, and made clear that if there was one child that was not reunified, the government was responsible for making that child an orphan. And I think the fact that there has never been, here's I think three interesting things. There has never really been a plan for reunifying these children. It has all been ad hoc. Number two, there has never been a single person who was responsible inside the administration for family reunification. This is something that the judge has asked for and now ordered, that there be one person, that person be the person who is responsible for all of it. And frankly, I think what's notable is we can all think of all of the things that the president has spoken about in the last 4 weeks or 4 months. Not this issue, not reunifying children. It's not important. It was never a priority. It was never something that they were going to really think about. And in fact, it was never something they had a plan to do.
Is there any chance that these children will be deported back to their original country without their parents?
As of right now, the way that the court order exists in the Southern District of California, the answer is no. But, over the long term, if the administration were to appeal that order, if they could get a favorable ruling from a higher court, I think it's a matter to be concerned over. I would say that as of now, that isn't something that's likely to happen.
Since not all the families were reunited, the 500 were not reunited by July 26th. On July 26th, what are the next steps for this case?
So the next steps really are the steps that we've been pursuing over the last 3 weeks since the deadline ran, which is to continue to go back to court, to continue to ask the court for further orders, for further direction, and for further involvement. And the court has shown an increased willingness to make specific orders. Just last week, the judge said finally to the government, I want one person that I can talk to. I want that person here in this courtroom telling me what's happening with each of these 500 cases. The judge has ordered specific information to be shared with the ACLU in order to facilitate the process. You know, we are not, the deadline passed, and that was unspeakably sad. I think it really is. I think it's a stain on the soul of our history, that this administration separated these children and then found no way in which to reunite them, and didn't seem ever, as I say, to have a plan or any kind of sense of how that would happen. That having been said, I think what we see now is the real hard work being done, through the court to get more information, to hold the government accountable, and to remain vigilant in terms of doing that. And as we said, we're still willing to help in whatever way we can. So, this may move out of the headlines. This may be replaced by the latest outrage or the latest scandal or the latest, dust up or the latest tweet from the White House. But the reality is that we believe, these children are our clients now, and we're not going to rest until they are reunited.
Is the ACLU able to follow all 500 cases? Individually?
Right. It's hard. It takes a lot of resources, and we don't have access to all the information that the government has, which makes it equally as, even more difficult in that instance. That again, with that said, that's not the end of the process for us, and we're going to continue to work at this and figure out whatever way we can to keep working and to get every family reunited.
Is it on account of FERPA issues that the government won't provide the information, or they just don't want to provide the information to the ACLU about the 500 individual cases?
My own guess of it is, having watched this litigation again from Chicago, but knowing the people who are involved and watching what's been said, I would say that this is not about individual privacy. These are our clients. I think that this is about the government, number one, who never wanted to admit how wide scale the process was for deporting parents without their children, number one. And number two, I think they've also wanted, really in large measure, they have wanted and resisted being held accountable for the actions that they've taken. And I think it's much more of those things than it is over any real recognition of privacy or any other kind of norms. This isn't an administration that exactly adheres to the rule of law in the strictest of ways.
So how does the ACLU decide which cases to pursue? I know that the ACLU decided to help these children, but
right.
What is the turning point for the ACLU to jump in?
It's a really tough question, as you might guess. Even in Illinois, we get hundreds of requests for assistance, sometimes every week, sometimes every couple of days. In terms of people who are in need of help of some kind. Now, many of those aren't really civil liberties issues. They're personal disputes that people have, and those are not things that we can do. But what we really try to do is to marshal the resources that we have to provide the most broad-reaching and effective kind of advocacy that we can. How is it that we reach and affect and preserve the rights of the most people? How do we ensure that what we're doing is really reaching out and helping the broadest range of people, the people who are at most risk of real harm? I think in this case with children being held in immigration detention, that's a pretty easy call. We have filed in Illinois, we filed lawsuits in the last few months and year over, for example, the pattern and practice of abuse of the use of force by the Chicago Police Department. That affects thousands and millions of people. It's the kind of thing that is important. We filed a lawsuit years ago that we're still pursuing on behalf of children in the custody of the Department of Children and Family Services, because again, these aren't kids who have lobbyists or publicists or really have any power within the system. So it's oftentimes those decisions are made to cover those wide-ranging kind of big groups of people. On the other hand, we will take cases when the issue is important and when the issue is critical to kind of reflect an individual matter that could become a larger matter. We filed a suit a couple of years ago on behalf of a young man from Peoria who was literally taken into custody and arrested because he started a parody Twitter account of the Peoria mayor. And it hurt the mayor's feelings, and so the mayor sent the police after him. We filed a lawsuit just a little over a year ago on behalf of a young man who was arrested because he burned a flag on the 4th of July and posted video on Facebook because Illinois had an old statute on flag burning that, even though it's been held constitutional by the Supreme Court, remained on the books. So sometimes the individual issues, reflect or could possibly reflect a trend or something larger that causes us to file something in that way. But, as a general principle, we try to look at the things that either on a state basis or a national basis can really affect the most people.
Did someone request the ACLU's help for the DCFS case? And did someone request the ACLU's help for the Ms. L case?
So let me take those in reverse. In the Ms. L case, there were immigration advocates in San Diego who contacted our National Immigration Project, and that was the way that began. In the case of DCFS, and this goes back more than 20 years, the ACLU had been looking at a range of issues about children who were incarcerated or detained as juveniles. It turned out that many of those kids were wards of DCFS. We began to hear from them about issues within the department, and that led us to do that. So in that respect, we always sort of learn of these things either through a direct request or sometimes tangentially. And looking at one issue, you learn about something else.
The ACLU is a 501c3 organization which prevents the ACLU from intervening in an election. Can you describe for us a case in which an ACLU case has political ramifications for a candidate, but the ACLU can still pursue the case and abide by its 501c3 IRS prohibition of election intervention?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me first say the ACLU, both here in Illinois and nationally, has a 501c3 and a 501c4 side. But what's
the difference between the two?
The difference between the two is that for 501c3, funds that are raised are tax deductible, and they are not used for any advocacy, legislative advocacy, or things of that nature. On the other hand, on the C4 side, we raise money, we do lobbying, whether it's in Springfield or in City Council in Chicago. We do a range of activities which are built around trying to change policy through legislative advocacy. Having said that, we still are a nonpartisan organization. We don't have a PAC, and we don't involve ourselves directly in elections. But there are issues that we become involved in which do have a political impact, as you say, and whether that's challenging the particular actions of an elected official while in office, the way in which we keep that from having we keep from crossing the line is we never engage in a political attack. We never say don't vote for person X or vote for person Y because of policy, the policy involved. But what we say is that person X or elected official X is advancing this policy, it's unconstitutional, and we're filing a lawsuit, or we're challenging it in some other way, or we're taking action in those ways. I think it's telling. If you look, for example, at the ACLU, which in 2020 will celebrate its 100th anniversary.
Congratulations!
Let's hope we all make it till then.
Yes.
During those 100 years, the ACLU has sued every president who sat in the Oval Office. It didn't make a difference, Democrat or Republican, progressive or I mean, we've sued everybody because there are some policies inevitably by government that run afoul of basic individual rights. And so therefore, there are always going to be challenges to policies from every administration. And I think that's the thing that keeps us from being political.
Are there many other organizations besides the ACLU that have both a 501c3 designation and a 501c4 designation?
There are some, our friends, for example, at Planned Parenthood have that designation, and then they use their C4 side for even additional political activities and, engage in other kinds of actual, partisan activities when they believe that they want to. So it's not uncommon, I think, to have that designation in both ways. I think what does make us unique in some fashion is the fact that we don't take positions on political candidates, and that our focus is really on, sort of the fundamental issues. And I think that makes it possible for us, in large measure, in Springfield and in other places, to work with a whole range of elected officials, no matter what their political affiliation. And I think that's really important and something that, candidly, I think is more and more important each day.
Well, I think you've been, all this talk is probably encouraging students to really want to work with the ACLU. So can you give us the students and our listeners advice about working on behalf of the ACLU? Sure.
So this is really an interesting time for that, because I think, so number one, I always tell this story, and it's one of my, to the point I think my colleagues are tired of hearing me say it. When I left the office on November 8th of 2016, the ACLU of Illinois had a little less than 14,000 members across the state of Illinois. Today, we have more than 72,000 members. And so if I were going to say to students, for example, we have a very inexpensive rate for students to join the ACLU. I think it's $15. It might be $20 or $25. But look, that's a week at Starbucks for me. So, a little less than a week, actually. But, I would say the first thing you can do is join the ACLU. If that's something that you cannot do, I would encourage you to follow us on social media and to join our People Power movement, which is a national grassroots organization in which people are sort of driving the kinds of issues that they want to work on, and it'll keep you informed on things, not just the big kind of latest national headlines, but what's actually happening in the state and in the community where you live, and how you can be a part of those things. I think that's really important. The last thing, and I think this is so important for students, and it's so important this year, we've talked about the fact that the ACLU is not a partisan organization, but we're also not blind, and I think we all know that this midterm election is the most important election of our lifetime. I'm old, and I'm saying that. It is the most important election of our lifetime. And so we've created a program called ACLU Voter that helps people, A, commit to voting, B, reminds them that the most important thing to do is make a plan for voting. Check if you're registered, find out where your polling place is or early voting is, and then determine when you're going to go do it. And by the way, take along 3 or 4 friends to do the same thing and encourage them to make sure that they vote. Every voice needs to be heard in this election. We need to make this about every voice being heard. We know that if we vote for people who share our values, if we vote for people who don't think putting kids in cages is a good idea, we know that the nation will look a lot different, and the way in which and the environment in which this administration operates will look a lot different. And so, that's one other way that I think that people can really become involved in what we're doing and really look at the ACLU as a vehicle for information that will help them, carry out what I think President Obama called the most important function we have in our democracy, and that's being a citizen.
The People Power movement, is that available in every major city or in Illinois, Chicago?
It's actually available nationwide and in every individual city. So you will, if you're part of People Power, you will get information about federal issues, about things that are happening, but you'll also get information about, say, something that's happening here in Illinois. Just last week, for example, People Power put on a big push to reach out to Governor Bruce Rauner, urging him to sign a bill that would have expanded voting rights in Illinois, specifically voting rights to people who are being held in jail pre-conviction, who still have a right to vote, and those leaving the Department of Corrections whose voting rights are being restored. Unfortunately, the governor did a mandatory veto on that bill over the weekend, but we got hundreds and thousands of people who were participating in that and were texting the governor, calling the governor, reaching out to their friends and letting them know. So it's a way to stay engaged on a whole range of issues, again, some of which you might not read about in the newspaper every day.
Yes, we were at a meeting in which one of the representatives of Chicago Voice or Chicago Matters was talking about that.
Yes.
We were also discussing how can we get more people of color to actually participate in meetings on matters that affect their lives, such as school board meetings or CAPS meetings, anything, because I have been at such meetings before, and there are very few, if any, people of color, and these issues affect their lives.
I think a part of this is that we have created a system in which people who have not been a part of it have been discouraged from participating, number one, and frankly have become cynical because they think that even if they do participate, their participation doesn't make a difference. I think that one of the things that all of us can do, one of the things that all of us can work on, is finding ways to, personally invite and bring people with us, is to make them see how their voice can be heard. If we're part of those meetings, is creating a space for those voices to be heard, perhaps instead of our own, in terms of assuring that the full kind of panoply of voices across the community are actually heard and adhered to as things go on. And I think the other part of it is this goes a little bit beyond just that question. Part of it is that we have to stop, all of us, being quite so cynical about the notion of government and whether or not it works. The fact is, every time we say it won't work and we just walk away, the fact is we don't bring anyone new into the system. We don't encourage others to participate. The people at Chicago Votes, I think that one of the most encouraging things about that organization is that it started as just a grassroots youth movement, and they've done some incredible work over the past few years. These are people who have passed bills and had them signed into law in Illinois. They believe government can work. They believe that if they work hard enough, they'll have setbacks, but they believe that they can make it work. And I think we need to open that opportunity up to more people. We need to tell those stories more often, and not just about the failures, but about the successes, because I think that's the thing that's going to allow people to understand that even down to that level at a school board or a school council or a CAPS meeting, that being there and being heard really does matter, and you can make a difference.
Spread awareness about these meetings mattering, and also bring friends who are people of color.
Yes.
As a start.
Yes.
So the majority of ACLU lawyers remain at the ACLU for a career, or is ACLU work a bridge and experience for other career paths, such as for litigation or attorney general work?
Oh, that's a good question. And frankly, it's a little bit of both. So we have lawyers at the ACLU of Illinois. I'll just say that for a moment. We have lawyers at the ACLU of Illinois who have been there for 20 and 30 and beyond in terms of years and experience. And it is really incredible and wonderful to have, that kind and level of historical organizational knowledge about what's happening. It is really helpful to have people who can share, an experience from 15 years ago that really informs what you're doing today. So we have a lot of people who've made it a career. We do have young people who come in and spend a few years and then go on to other things. We just had 2 young lawyers leave us this summer in that way. I will predict that probably both of them will be back at some point in their careers just because of, I think, their experience and secondly, how talented they are. And so I think that will be a part of it. But, I'll just say, and this is not in the lawyer category, I joined the ACLU of Illinois in 1999. And some of your listeners probably weren't even born in 1999. But I literally said in my interview that I viewed this as being something that I would do for 5 years and then go on. And every time there's come a point where I've even thought, geez, I wonder what's next, something else has happened and I've ended up staying. And, if you think about that, for me, I'll just say on a very personal level, I can't, the night of the 2016 election, probably for many of us was, one of the most painful experiences of our lifetime. I don't know about you. I didn't sleep. But what was different for me, what I realized a couple of days later, for all the text messages and the calls and the emails and the Facebook messages and other things that I got from friends and family and everybody was, I got to go to work the next day and do something about it. And that's a really empowering thing. It's a really important thing. And it's the reason why, once people come and are a part of it, they tend to, with some exception, they tend to stay because it does become a part of one's being.
That is the turning point. It was the election that raised the numbers of ACLU lawyers from 14,000 to 72,000.
Members, not lawyers.
Oh, members.
Members and supporters in Illinois from 14 to 72, yes.
Oh, just in Illinois.
Just in Illinois. The number nationally has increased by about the same percentage, and I forget what the last number is, but it's in the millions. And, this is a time, this is a time when people see a group like the ACLU as being one that can stand up and push back against an administration like this when the majority in Congress don't seem to have any issue or any interest rather in doing any oversight.
So one of the benefits of being an ACLU member is being more informed and a more informed voter, and also being a better participant in issues that matter.
What we know is from some data is that ACLU members participate in the electoral system and vote at a rate that's about sometimes twice as high as the general public. If you are someone who thinks that you think that participation is important and you're concerned about things that are happening right now, you can pretty well be assured that your values will align with ours. Now, not on everything, and that's one of the other parts of being a civil libertarian is we disagree with ourselves as often as we don't, but it's a great vehicle for getting information, for staying informed, and for looking at those things that really matter for you, not just today, but certainly down the road.
For generations.
Yes.
Are there any lawyers that from ACLU that went to work for Chicago Votes?
No.
Not yet.
No, not yet. We've worked with them on We've worked closely with them on a variety of different legislative issues, but I don't think we've lost any staff to them as of yet.
What issues did you work with them?
So we worked with them on the Election Day registration in Illinois and on the automatic voter registration, which were successful. And then we worked very closely with them on this recent effort to, we actually got a bill, House Bill 4469, passed that would expand voting in jails across the state of Illinois and provide this information to people who are leaving IDOC. And unfortunately, the governor took an adverse action last week, and so we're going to have to figure out which way to go with that. But part of that is seeing, working with them on that. You get to see a lot of this other work that they're doing, and it's just really impressive.
Thank you so much, Yohnka from the ACLU, for discussing so much about ACLU, its work for immigrant children and their families, and everything else. There is so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.